Our first guest is the author of Ratfucked. You may have read it a few years ago. He is one of the nation's experts on gerrymandering, and his most recent book is called Unrigged: How Americans Are Battling Back to Save Democracy. It is David Daley. Thank you so much for joining us virtually, as we all are right now in this new era. So last time we tuned in was a couple years ago. I was on my SiriusXM show, and you were talking about the gerrymandering of America. And it doesn't seem like, despite 2018 wins and winning back the House, it doesn't seem like it's getting much better. Where are we right now in the state of democracy in America, David?
The state of democracy in America is dire, but citizens are determined to improve it. I mean, let me start with the dire news first. There are 59 million Americans who live in a state in which one or both chambers of the state legislature are controlled by the party that won fewer votes in 2018. 59 million of us, that's almost 1 in 5. And if you want to think about the partisanship of that, all 59 million of those people live in states where Democratic candidates got more statewide votes. Republicans still hold all of the power in those chambers. So the lines that were drawn by Republicans in 2011 continue to hold up. They continue to define the state of play in state legislatures and also in Congress. Democrats managed to take back the House in 2018. They pulled an inside straight in the handful of competitive districts that were left. And they were helped out by the fact that courts overturned some of the worst Republican gerrymanders in Pennsylvania, in Virginia, and in Florida, resulting in new maps in some of those states in the middle of the decade. The good news is that Americans have had it with this. Red states, blue states, purple states, all Americans hate gerrymandering. They know that it's cheating. In 2018, you had 5 states. And these are some unpredictable states. They are Ohio, Michigan, Missouri, Colorado, and Utah that passed ballot initiatives creating independent commissions or trying to take the power to draw district lines away from politicians. So that is pretty amazing news. With the exception of Utah, where it was close, all of the other ones won with 60, 70% of the vote. So that's red states, it's blue states, it's Democrats, Republicans, Independents. It's really hard to get 60% or 70% of the vote for anything these days. But regular Americans understand that this is bad, that it's wrong, that it's pushed our democracy to the extremes, that it's polarized us, that it's created gridlock and dysfunction, and they want it stopped.
I mean, it is such sophisticated electioneering. I mean, in your previous book, you talk a lot about this, but when did this new type of electioneering that sort of, I mean, I guess this is my editorializing, but it seems like it's going against the demographic shifts. It's electioneering for a few that really don't represent what America looks like today, maybe a little bit what it looked like 30, 40, 50 years ago. Is that correct?
I think that's exactly right, and I think that's intentional. Republicans hit on this strategy of using redistricting as a path back to power after the 2008 election. So 2008 brings Barack Obama, and it brings a Democratic supermajority to the U.S. Senate, right? 60 seats. That's really hard to imagine now. Also a renewed majority in the U.S. House. And Republicans looked around that night and they said, boy, the demographics in this nation are changing. What are we going to do? And a handful of strategists ahead of 2010, they realized, oh, wait a second. 2010 is a redistricting year. It's a census year. We're going to redraw all these maps in 2011. We could control that entire process if we spend, a few $1 million trying to win key state legislative races in places like Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, North Carolina, Ohio, Michigan, Florida. And they pull this off. 2010 is a good Republican year, but it was also a strategic Republican year because they focused down ballot in these key states. They flipped all of these legislatures, and they haven't flipped back ever since because Republicans were aided by the amazing new technology. Gerrymandering's been with us for a long, long time. It's the oldest political trick in the book in many ways. But the gerrymandering that gets done in 2011 is more technological than ever before. It's more precise and surgical. The big data that's available on us all is just so voluminous. They're able to go up and down the street and create exactly the districts that they want and create maps that give them power for a decade.
Okay, so we're in a census year right now, in the midst of this crazy moment where who knows how accurate the census figures are going to be reflective of society. It's already difficult enough, and add in the layer of everybody's stuck at home and unable, just worrying about whether or not they're going to survive the next, few weeks, months, economically or health-wise. So prior to this crisis, where did you think, when you were writing this book, where did you think this year was going, what was going to look like after this year's census with the Republicans and the Democrats? Strategically.
I think there's good news and bad news, right? The good news is that the Democrats are very well aware of the importance of 2020 this time, in a way that they fell asleep in 2010 and didn't even realize this. I talk with Eric Holder in the book, who's really heading up the Democratic redistricting efforts ahead of the next census year. And he says, we had never heard of these Republican plans. And he told me a story about being in the Oval Office with Obama after the 2012 election and looking at the numbers and and the two of them saying, we did pretty well. How come we didn't win any of these states or more seats in Congress? They had no idea what had happened. They're pretty fully woke now, So they're out there and they're trying to make progress. The challenge is that it's really uphill because you've got to take back some of these state legislatures, and the state legislatures have got these tilted maps. So you've got to win on these maps. Democrats have not been able to do that in any of these states this decade. So 2020 is going to be all important. The good news out of Michigan, for example, is citizens stepped up and won an independent redistricting commission there. So citizens did what politicians could not, and things will be better in Michigan. In Virginia, another citizen group demanded essentially that the state legislature fix a redistricting. It will be a slightly fairer process there. In Pennsylvania, the state Supreme Court has stepped in. It's going to be fairer there. But in a state like Wisconsin, for example, it's really hard to see a road back. I mean, in 2018, Democrats kick out Scott Walker of the governor's office. They re-elect Tammy Baldwin to the Senate. They elect Democrats to every single statewide office in Wisconsin, and they favor Democratic Assembly candidates by 200,000 votes. And Republicans still hold a 63-36 edge in that chamber. So it is really, really uphill. The Supreme Court is not going to be anybody's judicial superhero. Citizens are going to have to do that for themselves. But the amazing thing I saw when I was out reporting this book was just how intent citizens are on fighting these fights and how they can win them even in
Let's talk a little bit about these independent commissions, because I think unless citizens are informed about it, they really don't understand the difference between that and the status quo in their state. So what does an independent commission look like, and why do we trust them over the current system in a state?
Because the current system in these states involves politicians drawing their own lines, choosing their own voters. It's the ultimate fox guarding the henhouse. It's a complete conflict of interest, and it shouldn't be allowed. No other country in the world allows politicians to do this. It's better when citizens, when non-partial people step back and have that role. And we've seen it work in states around the country. California is the best example. They've got a citizen commission. I believe it's 15 people, 5 Democrats, 5 Republicans, 5 independents. They hold public meetings. They draw all the maps in public. So it's all completely transparent. It's not behind closed doors like it is when the politicians do it. And they have to come to consensus on the map. So they have to think about communities of interest. They have to hold, counties together. And then most of these commissions require supermajorities of Democrats, Republicans, and independents to approve a map. So you can't simply have two groups team up together and cram the maps down the other side. It doesn't work that way. So in many ways, it mirrors the kind of politics we would like to see, right? I mean, imagine if everybody had to actually get in a room and talk together and work out their problems and try to solve them. And it's worked really, really well in California. And a lot of these new commissions that passed in 2018 are modeled on that.
Mm. So looking at the map right now and states that could potentially be a little bit more fair. I mean, can you just name some of the states that could potentially have an independent commission or, in the next election cycle could balance out a little bit more based on just demographic shifts, even with gerrymandering, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I don't think we've seen a lot of huge demographic shifts over this decade that are going to affect 2020 the way Democrats might prefer. North Carolina, Wisconsin, Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, all of those states, Democrats continue to win. I would keep my eye on Arizona and I'd keep my eye on Texas. I think both of those are nearing a tipping point. I don't see it coming in 2020. The other danger here, and I don't want to get too far down in the weeds, but I think this is something that people ought to be aware of and starting to think about, which is that while Democrats have caught up to the Republican strategy from 2010, Republicans are going to have a new strategy in 2020. They're not just standing.
Right.
They don't ever do that, right? I mean, when you are losing the demographic war, you have to win the creativity war when it comes to suppressing the vote and putting up barriers. So what that they are going to try to do, and I've heard the tapes of their secret meetings at ALEC conferences in which they tell Republican legislators that what they need to do in 2021 is to not draw districts based on total population, on everybody, but to draw them only based on citizen voting age population.
Right.
Above the age of 18, which means a whiter, older, more rural, and more conservative group. And that's got the power to roll back about 20 years of demographic change across states like Georgia, Texas, Florida, Arizona. So the Democrats in state legislatures have got to be on the lookout for this. It sounds wonky, it sounds boring, but it could redefine our politics.
Because you have immigrants coming in and their children are citizens, but the parents may not be able to vote, especially if they're the children of undocumented. And in states like Arizona, that's enough to change the makeup of the legislature.
That's exactly right. It's exactly right.
Wow. So I would be a bad DNC exposer, I guess that's the term, if I didn't bring up the point that, Barack Obama did sort of fall asleep at the wheel when it came to state legislatures, and the DNC, notably after he became president and the head of the DNC, the figurehead, the money really went straight towards the presidential races, and they pulled money from state parties, which were essentially there to boost local electeds and local lawmakers and build the party apparatus, which of course helps when you're fighting at the legislative level. So, one of the complaints that I've heard from when I was covering the DNC chair race and beyond is that great, Eric Holder started this organization with President Obama, but why didn't you fund the mechanism within the DNC that funds the state parties? Why didn't you fund that group? And there's some friction there. I mean, did you have any of those conversations with Eric Holder or anybody else who may have any knowledge of it?
Yeah, I think that they, the DNC, I think, is a kind of organization that tries to keep its power very close, right? We saw that this year when they tried to, create a blacklist and cut off anybody, any consultants or pollsters who wanted to work with primary challengers. They fell asleep at the wheel in 2010, and the consequences for that have been, deadly for our politics. It's meant a decade of conservative dominance in state legislatures around the country. It's meant that, the Democratic bench has atrophied in all of these states. It's led to policy in a lot of these places that is just so far right, even in states like North Carolina and Wisconsin, Ohio, Michigan, even in purplish states. So there's a lot of blame to be handed out. I think that they're aware of the problem. I'm not always sure that they're doing what needs to be done to fix it. What I've been excited by is seeing so many new groups that have come forth determined to sort of rebuild the party at the ground up. And I do a chapter in the new book on them, on Run for Something and Flippable and Sister District and Forward Majority, and sort of all of these groups that sort of understand that state legislatures are the building blocks of everything. And until Democrats find a way to win these back, and they have to win them back everywhere, not just in blue states. They have to find a way to win them back in Georgia and in Arizona, places where, Democrats haven't won in the last decade. It's really, really hard to do. These groups, I think, have a new awareness of the problem, and they've been taking it on with some success. It seems to me that the success the Democrats had in winning back seats in Virginia and winning back seats in New York State, some in Florida, have really been due to these new groups and kind of the new progressive energy at that level.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a New York resident who happens to be in Arizona right now, but I was very involved really early on with the Take Back, the IDC level, the challenge to the Independent Democratic Conference, which was, just as a reminder to anybody who isn't aware, there were 8 Democrats who were in Democratic districts that were literally conferencing and caucusing with Republicans, holding up the state Senate in New York State, which should really be an entirely Democratic state. The voters elected Democrats. And on the topic of this show, which we start off talking about Andrew Cuomo, it was by the design of Andrew Cuomo. Blake Zeff was one of the reporters who early, touched on this early. And, we might be loving him right now, but let's not forget that IDC held up quite a bit of pretty mainstream Democratic legislation, like, solidifying a woman's right to choose, for instance, in New York State, and much, much more, like the New York Health Act and protecting immigrants. Just there's a long list of issues. So, it was amazing to see these groups pop up after 2016, and not just progressives. I mean, that's what I think was really interesting, is it was this coalition between people that voted for Hillary Clinton, that worked on Hillary Clinton's staff, rising up and running for state Senate as challengers to Democrats. I mean, that was kind of unheard of unless you were a far leftist for many, many years. So there's some hope there. But, bringing it back to what you're saying, the Eric Holder organization, I think a lot of people fear that, okay, this is just another organization that a bunch of consultants are going to make a lot of money on.
I followed Holder out to Ohio, where he was involved in the state auditor race. And that's a really important race for redistricting out there. Nobody knows it, right? It's a state auditor, but that office holds a seat on the statewide commission. I followed him out to Wisconsin, where he was involved in Supreme Court races, because that's the only way for Democrats to win back any levers of power there, is to, try to do it in the courts. So I do think that they're strategic and sort of focused on the underballot in creative and smart ways, but they've got a lot of making up to do for what went down 10 years ago.
Well, I'm probably going to have to call you again soon, because we have no idea how this census is going to play out. Do you have a sense? I mean, are you reading anything about the effects of this crisis in the census reporting?
I think it's too soon to tell. It's certainly going to be hard for people to go out and do the kind of door-to-door census work. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, everybody's at home, right? I mean, I filled mine out already. Perhaps there will be a bigger early jump on census reporting than there would have been otherwise. I think a lot of those envelopes hit our our mailboxes, just as we all started social isolation.
Yeah, exactly. And, we often forget about the people who don't have access to broadband, who are in rural communities, and how that's going to affect the census numbers in the end. David, super interesting conversation. We can't take our eyes off of this stuff, in the midst of a crisis. Sometimes it's by design, sometimes it's by accident, but the people who are in power definitely benefit when we're not paying attention to the details like this in the process. So I really appreciate you for always focusing on it, and I would love for you to write a book on the Democratic Party at some point. I mean, I'm just going to throw that out there.
I think that there's a lot there. This new book has a lot of hope and optimism in it. It's a lot of stories of people stepping up and fighting back and winning in unlikely places. And I think we could all use some hope and optimism right now.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you, David. Stay safe, stay healthy, and I hope you can get some writing done while you're quarantined, because that's I was reading some history. Like, a lot of amazing things happen throughout history through past quarantines. So, maybe some good stuff will come out of this too.
Silver lining, my friend. Thanks again.
Thanks, David.